Today's guest is Daniel Unterbrink. Daniel has dual degrees in accounting and education from the Ohio State University. He spent over 20 years in Medicare Auditing and retired 4 years ago. In 2004, Daniel published his first book entitled Judas the Galilean. This book set forth the theory that the historical Jesus was not the Gospel Jesus of Nazareth, but rather a man of history, Judas the Galilean. He followed that up with two other books, New Testament Lies and The Three Messiahs, which strengthened his argument based on more historical data. His new book, Judas of Nazareth, summarises the findings set forth in the previous books and adds significant insights into the formation of the gospel story as well as the life of Paul. So let's see if we can shed new light upon three big questions. Who was the historical Jesus? Who was the historical Paul? And who wrote the Gospel of Mark? Daniel, you're very welcome to Alchemy Radio. How are you?
I'm fine. I'm looking forward to having a good discussion.
Likewise, I think there are some very juicy topics and nuggets of information that we can go into and delve into in depth. But before we do that, there's a question I like to ask most guests who come onto the show, if you're happy enough to answer it. And I suppose that's, how did you get from where you were initially to where you are now? Because your background isn't in Jesusology, if there is such a thing.
No, it isn't. I basically have a background in accounting. And this was always kind of a hobby of mine. I grew up Roman Catholic, but when I was about 20 years old, I got involved with a very fundamentalist church. So I spent, like 8 hours a day reading the Bible. I mean, it was just constant. And I got an idea of where everything was in the Bible, and then I started reading history, and the problem was as I started reading a lot of the history, a lot of questions were raised. So as I developed, years went by, and I kept reading, and then I had certain authors that I really enjoyed, and I could usually tell if something was in line with what I thought was consistent with common sense versus some of the traditional views of Christianity. But I think it was probably back around 2002, I just happened to be having a discussion with somebody at work, and we were talking about the birth narratives of Jesus. So, I went in and looked at Matthew and Luke, and, I said, well, one of them is 4 B.C., and one of them is 6 A.D. There's like a 10 or 12 year difference between the two. Yeah. So, that raised some questions in my mind, which I'd already been aware of that. But then I went into Josephus's writings, who is a Jewish historian, and those two dates pointed to an individual named Judas. So at that point, I became very interested. So it was a couple-year search into all the documents and everything I could find about this individual, Judas the Galilean, and I found that this was probably as close a match as you could get for who I would have considered being a Messiah figure in the first century. I came about it. It took 25 years to get to that point, but eventually that became my passion. For the last 10 years, I've been kind of researching that.
And you've come to some fascinating conclusions as well. Now, as somebody brought up in Catholic Ireland and who went to Mass every week and that kind of thing, most people who are raised in the Catholic Church in Ireland, I suppose, certainly in my experience and my peer group, would have been brought along to Mass, and that would have been it. We didn't really read the Bible. As far as we were concerned, Jesus was just a guy who was spoken about by a priest in robes at the top of an altar. We knew that he probably had a beard and long hair. We knew that he was the Son of God and that he performed miracles and he ascended into heaven and rose again and all this kind of stuff. But to be honest, most people, in my experience, wouldn't have known a whole lot beyond that. And there's this little thing called faith, which we were brought up to have, and we were told, look, don't question anything, have faith. And you mentioned common sense, Daniel, a few minutes ago. And quite often there is this dichotomy, there's common sense versus faith. And I think that leads a lot of people away from questioning the church or the Bible or any kind of religious investigation. So did you face any challenges from your peer group or the people that you associated with when you decided to go down this route initially?
Well, one of the first people that read my first book was my mother, who was very Catholic, and she was at least willing to read the book. And I really, she died about 10 years ago, but to this day, I don't know whether or not she agreed with me or not. But at least she was willing to read the book. So, there are a lot of people would just shake their heads and, not agree with me, or, they hold on to what they believe. And I said, that's fine. I think, at least in this country and most countries, you have the right to believe whatever you want. What I am just presenting is a historical approach to these questions. And, if it shakes some people's faith, so be it. But, to me, I had that urge to and desire to find out what I consider to be the truth. So, I think it does ruffle some feathers, but, in a way that can be a good thing too.
Absolutely. It makes life a bit interesting as well. And one of the notable factors in your work is the fact that you've, I would imagine deliberately, but you certainly have seemed to steer clear from any kind of Christian interpretation or a single type of interpretation of the origins of the story that you present. I mean, you've looked at historical fact and data, and that's quite an unusual thing because so many people will reference based on an existing paradigm and they won't look beyond that. But I mean, you've gone into this with a very broad and open mind, haven't you? Well,
being an accountant maybe helped me in that regard. Because let's say you're a PhD in this subject matter, well, you've learned and you've had everything ingrained in your head for so long that it's hard to get away from the traditional viewpoint of things. For instance, the timelines. You're sure that John the Baptist came in 28-29 A.D. Where I'm looking at that and I go, well, wait a second, let's look at some other data. If I had a PhD in that, maybe I wouldn't have looked as hard as I did. So, I mean, there are some advantages to not having that background.
Let's look at the overriding question then, because I suppose the broad summation of your work is that Jesus is not the Jesus that we are led to believe based on accepted Christian paradigm. So, who is Jesus? Who could he possibly have been? Did he exist at all? Or did he just exist in a different form to that which we're normally taught? Massive questions here, but you've dedicated almost 20 years of your life to it, so you've got some of the answers for us.
Yeah, well, I think the historical figure behind Jesus of Nazareth is a person named Judas the Galilean. And Josephus writes about him and his movement throughout his book. Scholars have looked in Josephus's writings for Jesus of Nazareth and his movement, and they can't find him because he didn't exist. But yet this guy named Judas the Galilean did have a movement, and it did exist, and it did, as he said, it kind of infected the entire Jewish world at that time. So here's a man that was much greater than even what we consider Jesus of Nazareth, because he developed a group that actually challenged the Roman Empire, which that was no small feat. That's like a small country challenging the United States. You just look at it and go, this is amazing. This guy did that, but yet he hasn't been given any credit throughout history, and there are some reasons why.
So tell us a little bit about this Judas. I suppose not to be confused with Judas Iscariot.
No, Judas Iscariot also is an invented figure. That person never existed either. But Judas the Galilean did. Judas, the first mention of him was in 4 B.C., right at the end of Herod the Great's reign. Now, this is a time when Matthew has the birth of Jesus. Okay, in 4 B.C., Judas and his partner, and it might have been his father, Matthias, they cleansed the temple. There was a golden eagle that Herod had erected at one of the gates that was a sign of fealty to Rome, because Herod was very close to the Roman Empire. So Judas, he was a nationalist. He didn't want anything to do with Rome. So they had he and his partner, when there was a word that Herod was sick and dying, they led a revolt or an insurrection where they tore down the golden eagle, and that was the first cleansing of the temple by Judas, and that was in 4 B.C. He and Matthias were arrested by Herod, because Herod was still alive at that point, and Matthias was put to death, and Judas would have been put to death also, but Herod just happened to die very shortly thereafter. And his son, Archelaus, who came to power and right after Herod the Great died, had a very shaky role. He didn't control the people well, so he kind of gave in to their demands. And one of their demands was for a prisoner release. And I think this is the start of the Barabbas legend. And after that, Judas was released, and then later went to Galilee and kind of reformed his group, and was proclaimed Messiah in Galilee around 4 B.C. to 2 B.C.
So essentially, in the early days, are we looking at a political movement of sorts as opposed to anything religious?
Well, the Jews at the time did not distinguish between political and religious. It was the same thing.
Okay.
For instance, the movement of the Zealot movement of Judas the Galilean, the fourth philosophy, their idea was that God was their only ruler. Okay, now if God is your only ruler, and Rome is ruling you also, it's a religious thing because you say God is your only ruler, but it's political also because you got to get rid of Rome now. So it was, depending on who you are, I'm sure the Romans looked at it as purely political, but to the Jews of the day, it would have been religious also.
So that springs a question to my mind, Daniel, and that's considering that our biblical Jesus, for want of a better term, is very unlike what you've just described. I mean, a political, religious rebel, really, Could he really, could this be the same guy, or why was this guy picked as the template, if you like?
Well, you have to get into the movement of Paul to figure this out.
Okay.
Jesus had his own movement called the Fourth Philosophy. For a better term, I've called it the Jewish Jesus movement. Okay, these guys are following Judas the Galilean. Around the year 35 to 40, Paul creates his own movement, and I've termed that the Christ movement, because he gets his message or his gospel from the risen Christ, not from any human being. So he has developed an idea of another religion, essentially, and he is preaching another religion. And if you read through the book of Galatians and the letter to the Corinthians, you see this back and forth between Peter and Paul, and they are not in agreement. So you've got two separate movements, and what happens, they eventually, around 44 A.D., the Jewish Jesus movement kicks Paul out of the movement, and that's included in the book of Galatians, where they turn their back on him. So Paul's kind of has a vendetta. he is really upset, but, the Jewish Jesus movement, they have disciples throughout the empire. Every synagogue they can maybe control. So they have a lot of power throughout the empire, and they're hounding Paul. So Christianity as we know it today would not exist had not the Jewish war happened with Rome. Because when the Jewish war occurred between 66 and 70 A.D., the Jewish Jesus movement was utterly destroyed. There were only a small remnant of them left. And at that point, the person named Jesus of Nazareth was created by Paul. And Paul was still alive at this time, although the Christian traditions have him dying in Rome in 64 AD with Peter. But Josephus has him meeting with Nero in modern-day Greece in 67 AD. So Paul was still around. So he, with the vacuum that is created by the destruction of the Jewish Jesus movement or the fourth philosophy, or even the whole Jewish nation in 70 AD, there's now a chance for Paul to regain his churches. But what he does is he creates a Messiah figure that is based on the framework of Judas the Galilean in the things that he did, but infused with Paul's own teachings.
Right, so essentially
it's a
what
combination.
We're looking at...
It's a composite figure.
Right, and essentially, I suppose it's the first historical motive for the existence of Jesus Christ and the name and the Jesus as we eventually know him.
Yeah.
Absolutely fascinating. And it's something that I've always wondered about, because even growing up, I remember being very young and sitting in Mass or listening to people talking about it. And I always wondered, well, things don't seem quite right to me. Religion personally never sat very comfortably with me. It seemed like a bit of a fairy tale. And I mean, again, a lot of my common sense was telling me, look, that's not the way it could necessarily be. But nobody could ever answer the question for me, well, why would somebody make it up? Some people would allude perhaps to, well, it's to keep everyone in check and to control people or whatever. But I always thought there had to be a reason going right back in time. It couldn't be that just in the 20th century, somebody with nefarious intent decided to hijack religion. I mean, it had to go back. And your work is the first time I've ever come across that kind of a hypothesis. And it's really backed up by so much historical record. So tell us, if you wouldn't mind, Daniel, how easy was it for you to source material and to go so far back? What are the records like? Because we're not looking at any kind of internet documentation here.
No. Well, the majority, I'd say 95% of the information is in Josephus, his two books, The War, which covers a period up to like 73 AD, and it covers primarily the Jewish war with Rome. So there's a lot of data in there. And his other book, which is a much longer book called The Antiquities of the Jews, which covers a period from the beginning of Genesis, essentially, up to about 67 AD. So in all those documents, there's a lot of stuff about Judas the Galilean, the fourth philosophy, his movement. And there's also a lot of things about a man named Saul, who is really the historical Paul of Tarsus. This Saul was kind of an unsavory character, but if you match him up against the Paul in the book of Acts, it's like identical to the things that they're doing, except they're different dates and the motives are different. So, I'd say that 95% of the information that I got was from Josephus. There's a little bit from Tacitus on the Great Fire of Rome. There's a little bit, just a couple lines from Suetonius, who talks about the Jews that followed Christ who were always causing disturbances. Well, that's very unlike our picture of what we think that the traditional Christians would be troublemakers. But yet Suetonius essentially says that these guys were Jewish troublemakers. So it's like this. A lot of these things don't jibe with the traditional viewpoint of Christianity. And then the last piece of what I would call primary evidence would be the letters of Paul, because he is writing, even though he has a bias towards himself and against Peter and James, who were the leaders of the Jewish Jesus movement. Even though he has a bias, he at least presents information that you can start to build, with the help of Josephus, a picture of what went on and the dates. So I would say, taking all that and then comparing it to the traditional story is how I arrived at what I arrived at.
Okay, and some of the parts of the story that we're all so familiar with are quite interesting, and they must have come from somewhere. So what did you unearth with regard to, for example, miracles or celibacy or any of these little quirks that have, I suppose, affected so many people who adhere to particular religions throughout the ages?
Okay, well, let's take celibacy for example. Everyone assumes that Jesus of Nazareth was celibate. But when you look into Paul's writings in 1 Corinthians, the 9th chapter, I think it's verse 5, he's complaining because he says, only I and Barnabas are celibate, but then Peter and all the brothers of the Lord, and he says brothers, so it's a plural. There's more than one, just one brother of the Lord. So, the Messiah had several brothers at least. It says they were all married. So everybody in the movement besides Paul was married. So you kind of have to wonder, well, was Jesus married? If all his disciples were, if all his real disciples were married, was he married? Then you get into the book of Mark, and even in Mark they have Peter's mother-in-law. So again, there's more confirmation that Peter was married. But I think that the reason why Jesus of Nazareth was not married in the gospel story is that he is a stand-in for Paul. Paul was not married. So Paul, who is writing the story, makes Jesus of Nazareth not married, and Paul claims that he was superior to the other apostles because he was not married, that he had more time to do work where they had to make their concerns with their daily lives and their wives and such. So that's why Jesus of Nazareth is not married, because he has just the concerns of God on his mind.
So it's
actually kind of a bait and switch.
Yeah, it's amazing. We could actually be looking at a situation whereby priests, for example, who aren't allowed marry and are supposedly they remain celibate throughout their lives, is because Paul wasn't a success with the ladies.
Well, it could be.
Wow.
That might have been part of his problem. I don't know. But, if you take it back even to the historical Peter, who was supposed to be the first pope, he was married.
Right.
So, the reason why they practice celibacy today is another passage from Paul in Corinthians where he talks about the unmarried man has more time on his hand to devote to God. And that's why the Catholic Church preaches celibacy for the priesthood. But again, there's really, other than Paul, all the other disciples, all the apostles, they all were married. In fact, if they're good Jews did marry, because that was a command from God.
Right, okay.
Right in the beginning of Genesis. And when you look into Judas the Galilean, he had at least 3 sons that are mentioned by Josephus. 2 of them were crucified, and another cleansed the temple before the Jewish war, and then he was killed. And then he had a grandson. You've heard of Masada.
Yep.
His grandson led the group at Masada. So this is how important this man was, Judas the Galilean. Throughout, from the year 4 BC all the way to 73 AD, his family dominates the political arena in Judea. So, and it's amazing nobody's heard of him.
Absolutely. And is it possible then to trace that bloodline right down to the current age? And what I suppose I'm really getting at is the popularization of works such as Piaget Lee and Lincoln's Holy Blood, Holy Grail, which Dan Brown and the Da Vinci Code kind of popularized and stuff, bastardized, many would say. I mean, is it possible to actually trace this to the current day? Is there any weight or any water from the research and the work you've done with those kind of theories? Because they don't fully tally, do they, with the work that you've done? No,
I really don't think so. I've written in the chapter on Foundation Legends, the flight to Pella, where the Jewish Christians supposedly escaped before Jerusalem was destroyed. And I've written about how, from the documentation that I've come up with, that they were probably mostly all killed. You know, that's why the Pauline movement took off, because the majority of the followers of Judas the Galilean were put to death. So I really don't see how you could even follow such a bloodline. I mean, there's just no documentation for that. It's a good story and it's interesting. I enjoyed reading the books, but you take it with a grain of salt.
Yeah, likewise. And something that's always struck me, Daniel, is there's a kind of a ritualistic, well, there's a major ritualistic aspect to the sacraments and the way that the Catholic Church has traditionally practiced their religion. And that, again, must have come somewhere. Would it be anything to do with pagan ritual in the past? Would this be to popularise Paul's movement, or where would that have come about? Yeah,
a lot of the rituals of the Catholic Church came from the pagan religions. The Gospels themselves point towards Mithras, Dionysus. I mean, they were borrowing from the pagan rituals of the time. And, and it was good marketing. I mean, if that was popular, your religion to compete had to be popular also. So, there was nothing. It's not like they had the internet where they could do a Google search on what was the original church like, or the original followers of Jesus. They were taught something, the people believed it. Everything from the blood of the lamb. These were rites that were used by other pagan religions of the time. So, and I know it's hard for a lot of people to grasp, but that's a lot of people would be in agreement. A lot of scholars would agree with that.
And what would you say then, Daniel, to those who would say that, well, I mean, surely it's just the case that the Gospels are a load of old nonsense by somebody with too much time on their hands, and they've been changed so many times down through the years, and the Bible has changed so many times, and depending on whatever king or whatever religious leader was in power at the time, they changed it to suit their own ends. So, how can we really trace back with any degree of certainty? What would you say to people who would just dismiss out of hand any kind of ancient historical research, such as the work that you've done?
Well, those people, I guess they have the right to believe whatever they want. I'm trying to reach the people that really want to look into this, that really are interested in their religion. Even if they don't agree with everything that I say, there's a lot there that can get them thinking. For instance, you've got a new pope now, and this new pope is taking the command to help the poor to heart, which to me would have been the center of the message of the original Judas the Galilean, because they practiced a pure, kind of primitive communism. Josephus called them lunatics. He called the fourth philosophy of Judas the Galilean, these people were lunatics because they give their property away. And we would look at that today as being the same thing. These guys are, like a cult. But this is what they believed. They believed that the kingdom of God was among them right now. So, to love your neighbor as yourself, that meant that you couldn't let your neighbor starve. You couldn't let him go hungry. You had to help him. So this was a community, or what they used to call the kingdom of heaven. The kingdom of God was a powerful message. And I like the Pope that you have now, because I think he is at least going to that one message. You might argue about other points, but to me that was one of the biggest messages of the primitive, the very early church. That most other popes, or even most other churches in the Protestant world, they pretty much, you believe and that's great, and then you're saved and you kind of live whatever life you want to live.
Yeah.
At least this Pope is saying, no, you gotta you got to act the part. And I think that was part of the original.
Okay, so there wasn't necessarily a get-out-of-jail-free card back in the day.
No, in fact, the originals, Judas the Galilean, John the Baptist, they all believed in following the law of Moses, because they were good Jews. Their only thing is the difference between their movement and other movements like the Pharisees or the Essenes is they were preaching a nationalism also. They wanted to expel the Romans. So they were the radical Pharisees. They were the radical Essenes, coalescing around this leader. But they still preached the law. And that's why when you read Paul's letters, he's always denouncing the law as being that it's not for his disciples, that they just need faith. Well, that wasn't what the originals taught. Judas the Galilean, John the Baptist, James, they all talked about following the law. And that's why you have two different gospels in the beginning of the first century. One preached the law, one preached grace, where you pretty much just believe and you're saved. Even Paul, by preaching that, he had situations in his churches where, they were sinning, and one of the people would say, well, the more I sin, the more grace I get. That mindset works today.
Yeah, that's one way of looking at it, and a lot of people do look at it that way today.
Yeah. It's a very destructive philosophy. On the other hand, the idea of practicing righteousness, being good towards other people, that's a very positive philosophy, and that's the philosophy of Judas the Galilean, John the Baptist, and James the Just.
Right.
As opposed to Paul's philosophy.
And one of the things for me, as I look at your work, Daniel, is context. I mean, context is a great thing, and what it has certainly done for me is provided a context whereby information that was seemingly unconnected can suddenly connect. For example, the political context that you describe in your work and your research suddenly means a lot of the pieces of the jigsaw that seemed disparate click into place for me, because it means that suddenly motive is provided where I mightn't have noticed it in the past. And suddenly there appears to be a reason why A, B, C and D happen in a particular order, rather than just, for example, divine intervention or somebody in the 15th or 16th century writing something down because they wanted somebody to believe something that benefited them at the time. So I think context is a great thing. Were you very conscious of that as you researched this work? Were you looking to provide context for the reader? I mean, that generally happens by circumstance anyway, but it seems deliberate and methodical, and it makes it very, very easy to access your work, in my opinion.
Well, yeah, I did, because I wanted to make sure the timeline was correct. One of the problems when you read the New Testament is there's an inconsistency on the timelines. Nothing makes sense. So I wanted to be, like you say, methodical and make sure that boom, 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 everything lines up. And then also look at it in terms of the what's going on in the political world at these times, to see if I can make sense of it. And if you don't have the right times, then you're not going to be able to apply any analysis to it. A good example would be the stoning of Stephen in the book of Acts. And when Stephen is stoned, right after that, Saul is introduced to the world as being he's persecuting the church. This is before his conversion, and this is in 35 A.D. Josephus writes about the same thing, except he writes about James the Just, the brother of Jesus, the historical Jesus, being stoned in 62 A.D., and right after that, Saul, the cousin of Agrippa, who's a Herodian, starts to persecute people. So what you have is a 62 A.D. event being put back in time by the writer of Acts to 35 A.D., which makes the post-movement, the expelled Saul, because he's been kicked out of the movement already in 62, they're making that evil person now into a pre-conversion person. So he's evil before he's converted, and he's perfectly fine afterwards. In actuality, the exact opposite happened, that he was in the movement, got expelled, and then later he's persecuting the Christians, into the 60s.
Yeah, but I guess that wouldn't make for a very good story if you were trying to...
Well, it's a great story, but it's not a good story for Paul.
Well, exactly. I mean, when you look at his motives and his ends.
Yeah.
So, essentially, we have a situation whereby you had a lot of parallels that you had to work out and work backwards and forwards along the timeline to try and figure out what fit where and why. That must have been tremendously frustrating at times.
Yeah, there would be times where I'd be driving back to my hometown. All of a sudden, an idea would come to me. So it's time to do some research. It's just, I didn't sit at a desk, for 8 hours a day, thinking about things. It just, one day something came, another day. It was just piecing things together over the years.
It almost reminds me of the creative process. I suppose my day job, if you want to call it that, is music production. And I'm not somebody who can sit for 8 hours a day in the studio, 5 days a week, just because it's that time of the day and create or have any kind of inspiration, or I'm somebody who needs to feel an emotional connection to what it is I'm doing. And obviously this was a labour of love for you, so there must have been an element of that whereby if you just sat down and tried to slog it out, it would become a complete chore and you'd never get anywhere.
Well, that's true, and you can even look at my first 3 books that I wrote. I've added from one book to the next something that, maybe a point that I didn't get right the first time. And then I'm re-examining things. I go, oh, here's a point that maybe is not right. And then I refine it, and then I refine it again. I think this last book, I'm not saying everything in it is perfect, because it's not. In fact, I actually had to cut the book in half, because I've got another book that if this one sells, I'll be able to publish also, that has even more support for this theory. But, it's been a gradual, like you say, labor of love. I've enjoyed doing it, and it is tiring, and it is, there's a lot of stuff there. But I have to thank Professor Barrie Wilson from the University of Toronto, or University of York in Toronto. He read through all my chapters, and he commented on it, wrote the foreword to my book, and so he was a great help. And also Professor Robert Eisenman, who is responsible for getting the Dead Sea Scrolls released to the public. He has written an endorsement on the book, and a lot of my ideas kind of originated from him, except he came at it from such a scholarly perspective. He could have one point, and you'd have to get to page 900 to get to it. Maybe one person out of 1 million would get to it. But what I've tried to do is make it more readable and then put everything together.
And did you uncover any kind of deliberate veiling of the truth at any stage in the research? I mean, surely with so much motive swirling around, there must have been people and historical characters down through the ages who deliberately didn't want a lot of the information coming to light. Or am I completely mistaken there, Daniel?
Even in the Gospels and Acts, I would say the majority of the bait and switch occurred at the very beginning in those. And then you have later times where you go into Josephus and maybe passages have been somewhat altered to hide the facts. That has also happened. But let me give you a good example about in the book of Acts. When they talk about Judas the Galilean, in Acts chapter 5, Judas is essentially said to be a one-hit wonder, and then his disciples are scattered and he dies in 6 A.D. This passage was based on a passage from Antiquities, but in Josephus's writings, it wasn't Judas the Galilean, but the sons of Judas the Galilean. So you have either the author of Acts deliberately used the wrong, the Judas the Galilean versus the sons of Judas the Galilean, or he just did sloppy homework. I don't know. But, there's a case where it gives a totally different meaning, and people accept Acts as being the Word of God, so even though you can prove that it's a mistake, people won't believe it.
Well, I've a lot of experience of that, as I think we all do. So, John the Baptist, historical figure that we hear so much of, but we hear so many differing and contradictory stories about who he is and who he was. Where does he link in with this whole body of work?
Okay. In the traditional story, John the Baptist is like 30 years old when he comes onto the scene in like 29 A.D. This was in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius, so that'd be about 29 A.D. And then really within a year or so, he's put to death. So in the traditional story, he's only around for like a year or two at most. Now, the Slavonic Josephus, which I've written about in the book, is another document that talks about John the Baptist. But the funny thing is they have John the Baptist introducing the Messiah in 6 A.D. instead of 29.
Okay,
and that 6 A.D. is right before the introduction of Judas the Galilean. And he preaches the exact same message. It's a nationalism of the same thing as Judas. And in Antiquities, there's a pairing at the exact same time in 6 A.D. of Judas the Galilean and a man named Sadduc, which Sadduc is a term that means righteous. And John preached a baptism of righteousness. So I think it's very likely that John was this Sadduc who was the kind of the second in command behind Judas the Galilean. And Robert Eisenman has also written about that, and he totally agrees with what I'm saying. So I feel very confident about that. So here John comes in 6 A.D. He's on the arena for 30 years because he doesn't die really until 36 A.D., not 30 or so like what the Gospels say. So he's around for 30 years. The Gospels pretty much write him out of the story. If he's only in the story for 1 year or a couple paragraphs, he was a big leader. In fact, after Judas the Galilean dies around 19 to 20 A.D., he's the leader of the movement for another 15 years. But yet nobody knows that. And the reason why John the Baptist is put to death in 36 by Herod Antipas, because Herod was afraid that John was going to incite a rebellion against his rule, because the people, as Josephus said, they would do anything that he asked them to do. So this John had great political power, great religious power. How did he get that if he was like an afterthought, like what the Gospels give him?
Yeah, well, it would make sense then.
Was leading the movement for a very long time.
Just even as you speak, so many of the parallels are suddenly drawn together and things make a lot more sense. And it's probably worth noting at this point, for those who mightn't be aware, the Gospels and what they are and who they're written by. I mean, the Gospel of Mark, for example, or the Gospel of Matthew, it doesn't mean that Matthew or Mark wrote these passages. So what light can you shed on that for the uninitiated, so to speak?
Okay, first of all, most scholars will agree that the first gospel to be written was the Gospel of Mark. And it was written sometime after 70 A.D. because it talks about the destruction of the temple, which occurred in 70 A.D. So most scholars put that first. Then Matthew was written maybe another 10 years later, around 80. Luke and Acts were probably written sometime after Antiquities was published in 93 A.D. because a lot of that data comes from Josephus. And then the Gospel of John is probably written just a little bit later than that. As for who wrote them, I'm claiming that the Gospel of Mark was either written by Paul, because he's still alive. The traditional church wants to have him dead by 64. They don't want him connected with this. In fact, they even say that Mark, who is the secretary of Peter, wrote this. But it's impossible because it's a Pauline document. It has everything to do with Paul's gospel and nothing to do with the original gospel that would have been preached by the Jewish Jesus movement. So I think Paul wrote that, and I have a whole chapter devoted to the many things in the Gospel of Mark that tie into Paul's own preaching. And then Matthew is supposed to be a Jewish document, but some of the most, it's really a Pauline document again, but some of the most anti-Jewish teachings throughout the ages have come from the Gospel of Matthew, like when Pilate washes his hands of the death of Jesus, and the Jews say, oh, let that responsibility be on us and our children for all time. Well, that's been a great excuse to persecute the Jews throughout history, and that came from the Gospel of Matthew. Plus, when Jesus dies in the Gospel of Matthew on the cross, the Jews aren't concerned, but it's the Gentile soldier who says, oh, surely he was the Son of God. So it's the Gentiles who are always the recipients, and they're the ones that have faith, and it's the Jews that put Jesus to death. So these were not Jewish documents by any stretch of the imagination. They were created for a Gentile audience, so that the Gentiles could be assured that their Jesus of Nazareth represented them. And this goes back to what Paul talked about in the 40s, because he would talk about the people of Israel, and he would say that they were going to be replaced by his Gentile converts, which is pretty radical, and that's one reason why they kicked him out of the movement.
And just when you reference the temple, Daniel, what specifically are you speaking about there?
The temple?
Yeah.
The temple in Jerusalem was originally, Solomon built the first temple. Mm. But the temple that we're talking about in Jesus' time was actually built by Herod the Great. Okay, it was a huge... Have you ever been to Jerusalem?
I haven't, no, not yet.
But the Wailing Wall, you've heard of the Wailing Wall.
Oh, yeah,
I'm sure
absolutely.
Most of the audience does. That was just one wall in this temple complex. The temple complex encompassed like 70 football fields.
Wow.
It was huge. You know, the idea that, when Jesus overturns a table or two, that he's doing much. Well, if you got an institution as big as 70 football fields, to cleanse the temple, it would almost have taken an army to do it. And that's exactly what he probably had behind him when they went to cleanse the temple.
Okay, so the temple is hugely symbolic then, and it's not just this small little chapel on the side of the road.
Oh, no, it was huge.
Okay.
And this was the center of the Jews' worship throughout the Roman world. I mean, if you wanted to make a pilgrimage on one of the holidays, like Passover, and go to Jerusalem, can you imagine the amount of money that the people that are running the hotels, the eateries, changing money, and the money changers, they're all making tons of money from this cult, the temple cult. But yet this was part of Judaism. And unfortunately, the people that controlled the temple were appointed by Herod the Great, and the money went to the Herodian family and to the high priesthood. So it was kind of a very corrupt system by the time Jesus was on the scene. And it became even more corrupt as time went on.
Yeah, things really haven't changed since then, have they?
No, they haven't, unfortunately.
So then when we look at some of the stories that people would be very, very familiar with, such as the birth of Jesus, or we've already mentioned the temple, but some of the milestone moments, the resurrection and things like that, what are they symbolic of, and why were these written into the timeline of Jesus' life, or the Jesus as we know him within the paradigm?
Okay, well, let's just talk about the birth of Jesus. The first record in Mark doesn't even mention it. I mean, they just have him coming on the scene as an adult.
Right.
Matthew first mentions it and he uses the birth of Jesus to introduce the virgin birth concept, which again was alien to Judaism. And they quote a passage from Isaiah, but it's interesting that they quote a passage from, I think it's Isaiah 7:14, from the Septuagint, which was the Greek version. In the Hebrew version, the virgin would mean young woman. In the Greek version, a virgin is somebody who hasn't had sex. Mm. So if you're actually, if you're using the Hebrew version, that has nothing to do with a miraculous birth by Mary, because it just that verse just meant a young woman. So that number one, there's a twisting of Scripture to get that point across. Many of the gods of the time, whether it be Hercules or whatever, had a human mother and God for a father. And this again is the paganism that is introduced into the birth story of Jesus. Now he is one and the same with Hercules and other great heroes of the time.
Yeah, sure.
So you've got that, but then you also have the idea of Bethlehem and Nazareth. Both stories of Luke and Matthew have to get Jesus to Bethlehem and back to Nazareth. Okay, and they both go about it in totally different ways. Bethlehem was in the Scriptures as being the place where the Messiah was born, and Nazareth is a town that is really not located anywhere in the Old Testament, in any of the Jewish writings. What it probably was that Judas the Galilean and his group were the head of a Nazarene sect, Nazareans, and they were revolutionaries. And what that was is a rewriting of a political aspect of the Messiah into a geographic name place. Nazarene becomes Nazareth. So there's a lot of sleight of hand going on too. So then everybody always says, "Oh, he's from Nazareth." Well, that place might not even have existed at the time. There's no evidence that it ever did. But even if it did, it was probably just used as a way to shift the revolutionary aspect of Jesus, of Judas the Galilean, onto this new Jesus of Nazareth. And then there's one other thing with the birth narrative. In the Slavonic Josephus, the birth of Jesus, there's also a Star of Bethlehem scene in that book. But it occurs around 25 BC. So it's a good 20 years before, and that fits in perfectly with the life span and when Judas the Galilean would have been born. So that's very interesting, but you haven't heard probably anybody ever talk about that.
No, absolutely not.
Which is pretty amazing. So, and one other thing, when even in the church historians said that James, who was the brother of Jesus, when he died in 62 A.D., one of the historians said that he was 96 years old when he died. Well, if you take that back, that means he was born right around 35 B.C. If he's the brother of Jesus, doesn't it make sense that Jesus would have been born around that time too?
I think so. Jesus being born before Jesus.
Yeah. So, the whole idea is that the timelines have been purposely altered to confuse. They're hiding the real truth, and they're putting forth what they want to achieve.
And one of the interesting things there is, not to get too psychological about it, but it only takes a little bit of confusion for people to lose interest in something and to totally discount it, I find, in my experience. And I think that clearly seems to be what's at work here, because you've been able to disseminate the information and quite clearly demonstrate that things should be in a particular order. And quite often it's just one little parallel or one little tributary of information that is enough to send people off in the wrong direction ever so slightly, and it's unlikely that they'll track back then. And that seems to have been the case throughout the intervening years, really.
Yeah. Well, I think the main point that the author of Luke did when he put John the Baptist in 29 A.D., every historian, every scholar in religious studies uses that as fact. Everything has to revolve around that date, and I'm telling you, that date is wrong. If with that date is used, nothing makes sense. But yet people have used it, and that's why they can't find a historical Jesus in the writing of Josephus, because they're starting from a point where you can't find it. You almost have to unlearn what you've learned.
Yeah.
And then start at it, afresh, and look at the historical data without the preconceived notions of what is and what isn't.
And how many times do we have to do that when we're looking at revisionist history? It's amazing. There's so much cover-up and neglect when it comes to historical timelines down through the years. It's incredible.
Yeah, that's true.
So what does that mean? I mean, you've another book then, I was going to say in the works, but pretty much done at this stage. Are there any revelations brought to light in that you could possibly let us in on that would tie in with the body of work that already exists? Or is that completely kind of top secret and for the next chapter, so to speak?
Well, I mean, what I've done in that book is I've given a little bit more detail on the fourth philosophy and the Herodian movements. And I've also spent some time looking at the 12 apostles. I'm looking at the family of Jesus. I'm looking at events in the gospel timeline. For instance, the feeding of the 5,000. Now, here's an example where it's taught in church, and you think that you have 7 fish or 5 fish, or how many fish there were, in loaves, and all of a sudden it miraculously multiplies. That goes against the laws of physics. But yet people believe that. And I'm thinking, is there another explanation to this?
Yeah.
And the core to the original Messiah's teaching was one of sharing. And what I believe happened, I think that this probably did happen, is that people went out to listen to this great prophet that's speaking to them. And if to give you an example, if I went out, I would probably just run out after the person, not even thinking about what I was going to eat later. My mom, on the other hand, would have been packing for everybody and probably packing for the next day, too. So there were probably some people that came prepared, and there were some people like myself that would have come unprepared.
Yeah.
The great miracle of this is that he got them to share. That's the miracle. It wasn't hocus pocus. It was the sharing of their goods with people that they didn't even know. So there was a miracle there, but it was just the miracle of sharing.
And what a miracle that would be. I mean, just to draw parallels with our current world, what if the top 1%, if you like, or the bankers or whoever else decided to do the same? It would truly be a miracle. Yeah,
it would. Well, the funny thing about Christianity, a lot of churches preach, basically prosperity through Christianity. But there's a passage in the New Testament where the rich young ruler comes to Jesus, and he says, I followed all the commandments. What else do I need to do to follow you? And he looked at the young man, he says, give everything you have to the poor, and then come follow me. And it said the rich man looked at him and then walked away because he couldn't part with his goods.
Yeah.
The whole idea was, the kingdom of heaven is here. Love your neighbor as yourself. But yet the person that said he wanted to follow Jesus wasn't willing to help his neighbor. So, it's a great message, but nobody hears it. And I'm thinking the Pope now seems to be on the right page, at least in that respect.
Well, I mean, it would be great if more people would hear it, and time will tell, and it remains to be seen. And I suppose as we begin to draw things to a close, Daniel, there were one or two very good comments when I was looking into your work a little bit further online that I came across from readers of your work that really struck me. And I'll allow you to decide whether these are accurate or not, but one that I thought was great for somebody who might be new to this information and might be kind of scoffing at what we're talking about now. Somebody said, do you really think it all began with a sanctimonious Jewish wonder worker strolling about first century Palestine, prepared to be enlightened with reference to your work? And that's quite a good summation of the work that you're doing. I mean, it's let's get real about things, because it was the real world. I mean, time did exist 2,000 years ago. Real people, real flesh and blood humans, no different to us, existed back then. And quite often I think it gets kind of brushed under the carpet and people think, well, yeah, that's just a fairy tale in a book. None of it could possibly have ever really happened. It couldn't be based on reality. But the simple fact of the matter is, there was a reality then.
That's true. And that's what makes this Judas the Galilean story so interesting, because he was a person that united people. He did it because of his own example. He did it, like I said, through the idea of sharing. That's one of their core values. You got to remember that most of the people that followed him probably didn't have a whole lot of money, if anything. So it would have been extremely popular to the vast majority of people. The people that wouldn't have liked it would have been the Herodian leadership, the people that are controlling the temple, and the Romans who want to collect taxes. Those are the people that didn't like, and that's why they wanted to get rid of this guy. And they ended up getting rid of him. So, I really do believe it's real. It happened. It's just been tweaked to an extent that it's unrecognizable to what really occurred.
Yeah, and I think it comes back to context again. If you put, for example, since I read your work, I hadn't been to Mass in years, and I decided, right, let's go in, and with my new context, let's see what fits or what makes sense or what feels right to me, because quite often it can be quite difficult to process all the information at once. But does this feel right suddenly with a new context? And all of a sudden I found myself sitting there fascinated. And I thought, you know what? So much of it here makes sense when it didn't in the past. So if nothing else, what it does is it forced me to question and to look at things and realize that, hang on a minute, there is another way. There's not just blind faith here. And I mean, I didn't have any particular faith in the beginning, but there is a historical context to everything. And if you do that, you will start to question and you will start to maybe look at things in a new light yourself. So what did it mean for you and your Christianity, I suppose?
Well, to me, I was just searching for the truth. I started this process, and it was kind of an intellectual thing to me. But I've talked to other people, like my sister says, well, what about people that say, that they live by faith? And the whole idea is, well, what I'm saying here, and what I think the real Messiah said, was to live your life, live a good life, help people, be a good person. That is the whole key to living a successful life. And I think that can still be followed, and you'll say, well, I won't go to heaven if I do that. Well, who's to say? What's your concept of heaven and hell? I really do believe that if there is a just God, He is going to judge us based on what type of lives we live. Not so much, well, I believe this or I believe that. Well, so what? Like James said, even the demons believe. So I look at it as just trying to live a good life.
Well, I couldn't have put it better myself. I think it's a very fine frame of reference for anyone who's embarking or in the middle or towards the end of their lives, because what can possibly be wrong with a message like that?
I agree.
Well, Daniel, how can we get our hands on your books if we're looking to do so? Now, we do have links. We'll get them up on the website. But tell us how people can find out more about you and the work and future work as well.
Well, I do have a website. It's www.danielunterbrink.com. They can go there. My book is on Amazon. It's also Amazon UK. There's a Kindle edition also. It's on lots of websites. So if you Google Judas of Nazareth and Unterbrink, there's going to be a lot of websites that you could go and purchase your book. Go into the stores and ask for it. They can order it. So, it's out there. It's just, a couple clicks away. But I would, start with Amazon and work from there.
So no excuses then. Just the way we like it. I have the power, you have the power, we have the power. Daniel Unterbrink, it's been fantastic speaking to you on Alchemy Radio.
Okay, thank you.
Alchemy Radio.